Welcome back then folks to the second build of day 3 of Special Projects Pack number 5, and this time it's a car which, much like the Lexus earlier on, I've actually had in the barrel for a while. I already did, of course, a racing version of the Pantera, now a racing version of the Mangusta. This is an interesting car, to put it one way. In stock form, it has very unique handling, let's say, because of how much weight is over the back end, and it's also quite high. It really doesn't respond too well to ride height changes either, so turning it into a race car, where you've got even less weight, even lower ride height, and even more power, well, it could be a bit of a handful, especially when in the case of this one, much like the Porsche that I did earlier on in the week, it's not exactly running a lot of downforce. Now with this one, this is a build which I would definitely appreciate some community research on, for those who are into that kind of thing. Because the car is real. This is based on a real chassis number. It was a Group 4 category, the real-life Group 4 version, of the Mangusta, which raced in SCCA, or to SCCA regulations, in the Florida region, I believe. Region 1 Florida, something like that. And the chassis number is real. It's 8HA1212, as you'll have seen in the thumbnail. The thing is, though, even though it looks spot on pretty much to that real car, I cannot for the life of me find the specs on it. So I don't know how much power it has, and I don't know how light it is. Now, there was a hill climb one, which looks quite similar as well, but it doesn't appear to be the same car. So for any who can find what the actual specs of this would have been, absolutely drop it in the comments, and if somebody can have a source on it, I'll probably pin that comment. For now, I've basically just given it an educated guess, which is to, of course, tune the handling and stuff in the way that I usually would, but to drop the weight pretty much as possible. And then as far as power, it's just a wild guess. So I've bumped it up to 435 horses. This is at the same time the kind of car which I could easily see as having like maybe 410. I think if I looked at this car and just guessed the power, I'd probably guess like 410. But I've bumped it up to 435, and like I said, that could be way off. Because look, for example, at the Corvette SCCA, the iconic one in the older Gran Turismo games, which I did in another pack. That thing's got stupid power, like well over 600, but I don't know how realistic that was. I think that might be a bit of overkill, if I recall correctly. So this is a bit of a Frankenstein build. I've taken some educated guesses, but there's only so far that can take you. So, like I said, if there are any who are aware, I even tried to look up the SCCA regulations to see, how much horsepower was allowed, how much engine size, etc. I couldn't really find that much beneficial information, but again, I've never been that good at finding stuff in racing regulations, so I know for some of you that is your forte. Get back to me on that in the comments, like I said. As far as the weight, of course, you want to do the stage 1 weight reduction. It comes with the comfort mediums anyway. I've said this in a couple of the other classic racing builds earlier on, but some people find that the racing tyres are too good. You want a bit more of a challenge. So for those people, I'll leave it totally down to you as far as what tyres you want to go with. As far as the Club Sports section, we've got the high lift cams. I just need to double check. We do have the high lift cams S once again, so I believe that does cancel out this one. You've got the high compression pistons, stage 2 weight, of course, the power restrictor and the ballast, just in case you need them. As far as the semi-race, we've got the fully customised ECU. Very realistic for a classic car. The racing crank, of course, the fully customised diff. I've opted for the fully customised manual box, again to keep that classic feel. I have not done the body rigidity. I have done, though, stage 3 weight, naturally. As far as the racing stuff, of course, silencer, filter, manifolds, pads, discs. Of course, as always, the discs don't really matter. You could go for drilled, slotted, or carbon ceramics. The racing clutch and flywheel, fully customised suspension, and like I said, I've gone for the racing hard tyres. For the extreme, to help it through corners, the steering angle adapter, and then for the ultimate section, just the high lift cams. So there is definitely more horsepower that you can get out of this thing. I just didn't want to push it too far. And like I said, there were 2 reasons for that. To me, from the look of the real car, it doesn't really look like a 600 horsepower machine. I think it looks more like a 400 horsepower car, but I could be way off base there. The second reason is because obviously the more power you put into a Mangusta, the more power you've got to try and control. So with a sub 1 ton car anyway, and take a look at that weight distribution. 3268 is absolutely ridiculous over the back end, but we work with what we've got, and as it turns out, it's a damn good car to drive. It's a lot easier than I thought it would be. In fact, it's more forgiving than the 911 even. So we've got the racing hards on there. For the suspension, the ride height is 105. So the worst nightmare, usually, of a Mangusta is to go to that low ride height. But we'll come back to in just a couple of seconds why I've done that. For the anti-roll, we've got it on 4, 30 and 40 for the dampers. And here is the key to having the lower ride height. The reason why the lower ride height is often a problem is because the car bottoms out, and then sometimes, like on the more recent 911 GT3, it forces the steering to go straight within the wheel arches. With this one, that doesn't seem to happen because the springs are so stiff, way up on 3.10. So if you think about it, if the springs are so stiff that the car barely has any suspension travel, then it's much harder for it to bottom out. So a race car does have stiffer springs anyway, so visually it looks good, performance-wise it's appropriate to the car, and it cancels out much, if not all, of that issue with ride height. As far as the camber, we've got 3. No surprise there, it needs a hell of a lot of camber. And as far as the toe, quite a bit as well. 30 in on the rear, 15 out on the front. As far as downforce, 10, 40 and 40. Of course, on a car like this, the diff makes a huge difference. I actually really like that setup for the handling. I wanted it to feel a little bit slip-slidey, like the 911, but also, you know, something you can actually work with. So give it a try and change it if you need to. It's got a pretty close ratio box. 5-speed, 260 km/h auto setting, so for a car with that kind of power, you will top out the gearbox on certain tracks. So again, I'll leave it up to you in terms of stretching that out necessarily on maybe like Le Mans or the Nürburgring or wherever else. As far as the ballast, none is added. The ECU and the power restrictor are untouched. You do have downforce to work with. We're running none of it. And the reason why I'm running none of it is, funnily enough, exactly the same reason as the 911 build, because you cannot get any on the back. And I tried it running maximum on the front just to see what it was like. Way too unstable. It turned into a drift car, except the kind of drift car when it just spins on the spot, like a spinning top. So, pointless. As far as the other stuff here, of course you can see everything that we fitted. And points-wise, 681, that's not too bad, given that it is on racing hard tyres. So I guess you could use it for some forms of racing if you wanted to, but speaking of driving it, we do need to, of course, jump out to the track to show you what it can actually do. Now, I put in a couple of laps with this one, of course, test laps, with trying to get the diff and the suspension to a point where I was happy with it, but also seeing how quick it could go, because obviously with a track like Interlagos, the braking times are a huge factor, especially down the home straight, and in a classic, you kind of have to get a feel for the car, because one of the beauties of vintage and classic racing, and I feel like this is kind of a lost art to some degree these days, is steering with the throttle. Cars these days have so much grip, so much downforce, and they're so forgiving compared to what they used to be that you can just fly through corners. Whereas back in the day, they had those skinny little tyres with loads of torque, they were lightweight with very minimal downforce, and you used to literally control a car's cornering with the throttle. You would see so many cars kicking the tail out and sliding through corners. You can definitely see that on this one. This one is one of the builds which I was not necessarily the least looking forward to, but certainly it's the one that I was expecting to be the most challenging to get it right. It's actually ended up being a much more forgiving car than I thought it would be, and alongside the Pantera race car, it's a pretty nice pair if you're not doing anything with your Di Tomazos. So if you do decide to use it, I think if you were a fan of the Mangusta but just couldn't get it right on the tuning, maybe just couldn't find something that works for you, you might end up really liking this one. So of course, if you do decide to go for this particular replica, with of course that very nicely modelled livery that the player has done, then of course I hope you have a ton of fun with it. I know for many of you, you probably don't use the Mangusta that much, so turning it into something like this could be quite useful. And of course, check out the other special projects this week, both to come in the next couple of days, and of course, the ones which I've already done. But for now, thanks for watching.